Okay. Brother Wayne Vogel, can you quote Ephesians 3 through 5 for me, sir?
No, I missed that on the test.
Did you? Okay. Brother KJ, can you quote that passage for me, sir?
Read it pretty well.
I'm going to take that as a no.
No, sir, I missed that one as well.
You did? That's an important passage to remember. All right, here we have our modern day Bible, and Brother Rudy in the back of this room is reading the Reina Valera 1960 version, and I've got an NIV up here with me and the Greek New Testament, and some of you have the New American Standard, you know. Where in the world did that Bible actually come from as far as physical evidence? I mean, what is the physical evidence that supports that actual Bible that we have? We are asking questions in this section of the course called the Transmission of the Bible Text, like what happened to the originals when Moses wrote the original manuscripts that he wrote. What happened to those? You know, these things were copied and recopied. How did that happen? Copied them and recopied them. What happened to the copies that were made? Did just anybody copy them, or how did that all come down? How can we know that the present text is accurate? I mean, think about this. Moses wrote the Pentateuch in 1400 BC approximately. So that's just give or take, let's just round it off and say 3,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago. How in the world could we possibly know that what we have today is anything like what he actually wrote? That's a question that a lot of people would ask. What actual evidence, I mean, when it comes down to actual manuscripts, what actual evidence supports the text of the Bible? What do we actually possess which would allow us to verify the text of the Bible back further in time to some extent that we can have confidence in it? These are questions we're answering. Now, the Bible itself implies the copying and recopying of the biblical text. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, it says, "So Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the time of the year of the remission of debts, at the Feast of Booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place which he will choose." By the way, the place which God would choose, that goes back to Deuteronomy 12, verse 4. It's talking about the temple in the new land, when it went into the temple, or to the new land. It said, "When you come to the place which the Lord shall choose, you shall read this law in front of all Israel in their hearing. Assemble people, the men, the women, the children, and the alien who is in your town, so that they may hear and learn and fear the Lord your God, and be careful to observe all the words of this law." So every 7 years, there was an assembly, and the Word of God, the law of God, was read to the people of Israel. Now, I have here one of my mini Bibles. This is my little Bible that I use all the time. There's a hunk of the Gospel of John right there. Bible. And there's a hunk of Corinthians flying around. And I've got, there's a big chunk of Galatians and Ephesians right there. And there's other chunks of other books. I got me a chunk of Revelation here, And it's all kind of boiled down to a wrinkled up folder of stuff. And I've used this Bible for several years. Now this is a new Bible that I've got. And I want to show you one of my newer Bibles. And I've only had this Bible probably a couple of years, maybe. And what we're illustrating is what happens to Bibles. See? What happens to Bibles has always happened to Bibles. But this Bible of mine is only like a couple of years old. And it's kind of gnarly, and it's all taped up and fallen off. And it's just a Bible that I regularly use to preach out of and stuff like that. But that one's and before that one I had another one and it wore out, and before that one I had another one and it wore out, see, and throw them away and get another one. But Bibles don't last very long. That's what I'm trying to get at. So, what do you think happened to that first Bible that Moses wrote for the people of God back there in the time of 1400 and some odd BC? Now, they had to drag it out and read it every 7 years. And then that's not the only time they drag it out. What do you think happened to that thing?
Probably wore out.
It died. It got frayed, it got wore out, and sometime or another it got thrown away or blown away. It died. Okay? It had to be copied and recopied in order for it to continue to be written. Now, here's one example we have of this. Joshua wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses. Josué 8:32. Joshua wrote there on the stones a copy of the law of Moses. Then afterward he read all the words of the law. Now, how many years after Moses was Joshua writing this copy and reading it to the people? ¿Cuántos años después del tiempo de Moisés escribió esta copia de la ley de Moisés y lee a la gente de Israel? So how many years after this did that happen? It says here there was not a word of all that Moses had commanded which Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel and the women and the little ones and the strangers who were living among them. So we understand that in the intervening years, every 7 years, the priests had read the law to the people. Joshua at least wrote a different copy of the law here and read that to the people. Deuteronomy 17, verse 18 is looking forward to the time when a king would sit on the throne of Israel. Deuteronomy 17:18. Now it shall come to pass when he sits on the throne of his kingdom. Who was the first king of Israel? ¿Quién era el primer rey de Israel? Saul. Right. When he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. This shows me that the priests were the keepers of the copies of the law, and that other copies were made from the priests' copies. See? The priests kept the copying of the law as their purview, and other copies were made from their copies. Where did Moses first deposit the law when he first finished it? He gave it to the Levites and the priests that carried the Ark of the Covenant, see? And there he deposits it. They were to read it to the people every 7 years. See? So it says, this copy shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God. Now, in 2 Kings 22 and 23, Segundo de Reyes 22 y 23, it's concerning the book, it's concerning the time of Josiah, el joven rey Josiah. Let's look at 2 Kings 22. Let's look down at verse 8 beginning. Comenzando con versículo 8. Verse 8 beginning, brother. Let's see here. Brother Jess, would you read starting at verse 8 there, please?
Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, who read it. Shaphan the scribe came to the king and brought back word to the king and said, Your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house, and have delivered it to the hand of the workmen, who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. Moreover, Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read it in the presence of the king.
All right, that's good enough. So this was in 622 BC. 622 BC. Now let's go back to Moses at 1400 BC. 6 plus 8 is 14, so let's just say it was 8 centuries after Moses. How many Bibles do you think we've been through in 8 centuries? Several, right? But this old copy of the book of the law of Moses was in the temple, where it was still with the priests. See, the priests were still kind of taking care of this. And he read this copy of the law of Moses, and Josiah tore his clothes, and there was a great reformation. So in this passage on the screen, in chapter 23, verse 2, capítulo 23, versículo 2, the king went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, and the priests and the prophets and all the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which was found in the house of the Lord. So you had, Moses commanded every 7 years this be done. Joshua did it in Joshua 8. Here you have King Josiah reading the book out loud to all the people. But it implies and talks about copies of the book of the law that had to be extant. Then after the captivity, which would have been probably 520, maybe even after that, maybe 500, maybe even after that, maybe in the early 400s, we have Ezra standing at the water gate in Jerusalem in Nehemiah 8. And it says he had this book of the law of Moses, and he read from it from early morning until midday in the presence of men and women, those who could understand, and all the people were attentive to the book of the law. So Nehemiah 8:3, surely after the captivity, this is yet another copy of the book of the law of Moses. Hundreds of years after, a couple of more 100 years, almost 150 years after Josiah. And Ezra's reading that. So it's clearly implied here that the Scripture is being copied and recopied and recopied and recopied and kept for future generations. In fact, there are numerous passages like Deuteronomy 31:24-26 that we read earlier, where it says, take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant, that it may be there for a witness to you. Isaiah 30, verse 8, Isaiah was to write it on a tablet, inscribe it on a scroll, that it may be a witness for generations to come. See? So if it was going to be a witness for coming generations, it was necessary that the book be transmitted, that it be copied and recopied. Okay? Now, everybody, the word manuscript is from two words. Hermano Rudy. Manos is hands. Scrito means to write. So manuscrito, manuscript, means to hands, to write with your hands. So a manuscript, brothers, is a hand-written copy. See? If it's printed, it is not a manuscript. Manuscript is written out by hand, the old-fashioned way, okay? So everything that they had in these days was in the form of manuscritos, manuscripts, see? Handwritten copies that were copied by one person or another. Like Deuteronomy 17, verse 18 says, the king should make for himself a copy. See? And that's exactly what happened. All right. So, the Bible gives us a promise in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 24, 25. God says, all flesh is grass, and the glory of it as the flower of the grass. The grass withers, and the flower fades, but the word of the Lord abides forever. God has promised us that His word would never be lost, that His word would always be there. And this part of our class shows how God has kept that promise, how He has preserved, by His providence, the actual manuscript tradition of His Word, so that we would have it for future generations. This picture here is a medieval illumination, meaning a medieval scribe drew that picture on a manuscript that he was copying, showing how scribes wrote things down by hand during that time. He was trying to depict one of the biblical writers writing it down by inspiration as he wrote this picture, but he was actually involved in the copy of the manuscripts. All right? The Bible, the library of books, was originally written in 3 languages. Hay 3 lenguajes originales de la Biblia. The first one is Hebrew. Most of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Hebrew is a Semitic language, spelled S-E-M-E-T-I-C, Semitic, S-E-M-E-T-I-C, Semitic, coming from the word Shem, like Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you know, los tres hijos de Noé. The descendants of Shem were Abraham and all those guys. And one of the descendants of Shem was a guy named Eber, E-B-E-R. And you believe that Eber is where we get the name of the language Hebrew, and that's why we have this Semitic language, the language spoken by the descendants of Shem. Hebrew was the language, the original language of the Old Testament. The top reading there says, Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Now, the Jews would not pronounce it that way. They would say, Shema Yisrael, Edonai Eloheinu, Edonai Echad. But they refuse to pronounce the name of Yahweh because they think it's too holy to pronounce. But the 4-letter word there is the name of the Lord. This is the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. The next line down there looks just like the first line to you. That's because the letters are the same, but it is a different language. Es como inglés y español. Las letras hay los mismos, pero los lenguajes hay diferente, ¿verdad? So, in other words, English and Spanish have the same letters, but they are 2 completely different languages, just like Hebrew and Aramaic have the same letters. They are 2 different languages completely. Okay? I'm not any good at Aramaic, but it says, and the elders of the Jews builded and prospered. It's a section from Ezra. The largest portions of any books that are in Aramaic are in the books of Daniel and Ezra. This is because during the Babylonian captivity, some of the people involved in the correspondence and everything there were speakers of Aramaic and not Hebrew. And so you have that in the original books of Daniel and Ezra. A lot of the book is written in Hebrew, some of it is written in Aramaic. Both Aramaic and Hebrew are Semitic languages. Now, in the Old Testament, as far back as Genesis, if you go back to, for example, Genesis, I want to say 31 here, just a minute. Genesis 31. En Génesis 31. Let's go to Genesis 31, verse 20. Genesis 31, verse 20. Brother Nathan McVeigh, please, sir.
And Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he was clean.
That's good enough. Laban the what? Aramean. Now, some translations will say Laban the Syrian. See? Genesis 31, verse 20, Brother Rudy. Does yours say Aramean or Syrian? El Sirio or Arameo?
Arameo.
Okay, it's Arameo. Aram, A-R-A-M, is the ancient word for Syria. So the country of Syria in the language of Genesis is A-R-A-M. Aram. So in your different translations, in your more old English translations, it'll say Laban the Syrian. In the more modern translations, it'll say Laban the Aramean. But it's just giving you the Hebrew word there for it. Aramean means Syrian. So Aramaic is the language of Syria. It is the language of Syria. Now, if you are to look at old archaeological stone cuts depicting Syrians, the Syrians are of the same people, the same Semitic people as the Hebrews. They look alike. They look like the Hebrews. Damascus was the capital of Syria. But Laban and Abraham, and those were relatives. They were the same blood. They were of the same people. So Hebrew and Aramaic are kinfolk languages. Okay? And as time went by, when you come down to the time of Jesus, the Aramaic and Hebrew languages had kind of amalgamated a little bit, and Hebrew in the time of Jesus was more Aramaic. See? And so when Jesus spoke daily, he probably spoke more Aramaic than he did Hebrew. The Bible, however, was preserved in the old Hebrew language. See? So a lot of times they would read it in Hebrew, and then they would have to explain it in Aramaic, which was called the Aramaic Targums, when they explained it in Aramaic. Probably something like this is going on in Nehemiah 8. Turn over to Nehemiah 8 for just a minute. Let's go down to Nehemiah 8, verse 8. Let's see how the New American Standard translates this. Nehemiah 8:8. Jeremy, what does that say?
I need just 1 second.
Jeremiah.
Yeah, Jeremiah. Come on, man.
Pages are stuck together. Just one second.
Genesis.
There we go. Nehemiah, what was the
8:8.
Okay. They read from the book, from the law of God, translating to give the sense so that they understood the reading.
All right. In other words, it was written in Hebrew, but they were having to translate it into Aramaic so these people could understand the sense of it, because they didn't understand Hebrew as well as they understood Aramaic. After all, they've been speaking Aramaic in Babylon for the last 70 years. See? So this is why parts of the book of Daniel and parts of the book of Ezra are written in Aramaic, and this continued to be the case in the time of Jesus, as far as the way it was spoken in everyday language. Jesus and his mommy spoke Aramaic to each other at home. But in the synagogue, when Jesus read the Bible, he read the Hebrew text of the Bible, and then they would have to explain it in Aramaic. All right, so you have Hebrew is most of the Old Testament. Aramaic is a few passages in the Old Testament. The New Testament is written in Greek. Utoskar agapesin hotheoso kosmos. You know, that's God so loved the world. So Greek was the worldwide language, second language everybody spoke in the time of Jesus. Alexander the Great had culturized the entire world. So does the language of business and commerce everywhere was Greek. You'd go into every little country and everybody spoke their own little native language, but they also spoke Greek. See? So Greek was the perfect language to disseminate the gospel throughout all of the world, and that's what the New Testament was originally written in. Now here's a wrinkle for you. I believe that the things said in the Gospels, listen carefully now, I believe that the things that were said out loud in the Gospels were originally said out loud in Aramaic, but that through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit it was originally written down in Greek. See? So it was originally written down in Greek, though Jesus originally said the stuff in Aramaic. And there are a number of places, even in the Greek text, where even the grammatical structure is more the Hebrew or Aramaic grammatical structure. We don't need to worry about any of that. All we need to worry about is that the original written languages of the Bible are Hebrew and Aramaic in the Old Testament and Greek in the New Testament. Okay? So, now, it is not proper to speak of the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. It is not proper to speak of the Greek version of the New Testament, because the word version means a translation from the original language into a different language. So the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament is not a version. It's the original language. See? But the Reina Valera version is a translation of those original languages into a different language, Spanish. And the New American Standard Version is a translation from those original languages into a different language, English. Okay? So the word version means a translation from the original language into a different language. And there are bukus of translations. The people that I study with on Wednesday mornings in the Ukraine use the Russian version, one of the Russian versions. Brother Jeremy Roberts, yes, sir.
If a version is a translation from the original language, does that mean that you would say that any versions that may have been translated from the Septuagint then would not be versions in and of themselves?
Well, they would be versions of versions.
Okay.
See? So those are twice removed. And Kenneth Taylor's translation is not really a translation, it's a paraphrase of an English version. So it's a version of a version. But version simply means translation. Translation is an act of men. All right, so three languages of the Bible are Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. 99% is Hebrew and Greek, but there's a little bit of Aramaic sprinkled in just for taste there in the Old Testament. All right, as we said before, for many years, for many centuries, in fact, for probably 3,000, 2,500 years of the history of the text was handwritten. And the art of writing by hand is still not lost. You see here a modern scribe with a stylus. That thing that he's got is a stylus. And scribes have been using styli, that's the plural, to write manuscripts of the Bible for many years. But this is the way copies were made from the beginning until now. The earliest kind of writing that we know anything about is called cuneiform script. The earliest kind of writing that we know about is called cuneiform script. Now, many of the archaeological finds that come from like 1800 to 2000 BC, you know, in the first part of the second millennium BC, we found documents going back that far. Those documents, like, you know, the Nuzi tablets, Mari tablets, things like that, those are in cuneiform. Cuneiform is a sequence of lines and cuts and dashes that are cut into clay tablets. That was usually the format of the writing. We've got things like the law codes of Hammurabi and other things like that. But this type of writing, which is a series of lines and intersections and cuts and shapes, it's basically lines and angles, it's called cuneiform. And, you know, Feng Wei's language, Chinese, has symbols. It doesn't have alphabet. And it's sort of more like this kind of a language with the various symbols, not necessarily alphabet. And theoretically, you could put these symbols together in a infinite number of ways, but they communicate ideas. They communicate statements of human beings. They communicate information. And, you know, if you just start thinking about the different languages, you've got Indo-European languages like Portuguese, Spanish, French, English, German, you know, all of those kinds of languages that use the same letters but are totally different languages, you know. We've got all those different languages that combine these different symbols. You've got a huge variety of Oriental languages, Indian languages, African languages, you know. Go ahead, Brother David.
I was just going to ask something I've never understood. I mean, with like the Greek language and the English language, I mean, we have letters, form them into words, but I've never understood it with these languages that are like symbols and stuff, is how you translate those into spoken language. I've never understood how that works.
Well, I don't either, because I don't speak any of those languages. But there are certain ways of putting those symbols together that have meaning in that culture. And they can, like, you know, Feng Wei would be the best one to explain stuff like that to you. But it's just a different way of communicating. But every language has symbols. Some of our symbols are just letters. But every language has symbols of some kind that convey ideas. They make up words. They make up, you know, we can communicate statements and thoughts and feelings in those languages. And the Bible was written down in human language. Some scholars used to say that language didn't exist back as far as the time of Moses, but now we know from these things and others that it did exist back then. And I'm sure even before then, you know. Some languages were spoken before they were written down. Like, for example, the Cyrillic languages that Russian comes from, those languages were spoken, and two missionaries named Cyril and Methodius went into those countries, and they didn't have a written language. And so they took those sounds that the people were saying, tones, sounds, and they made symbols to represent those sounds, and they made a language for them, which eventually became Russian. You know, people have done that all over the world. So the point is that human beings are put together in such a way as that they can communicate ideas. And the divine being, God, has communicated with man in human language. It's a very precise way of communicating so that we understand what's being said. Now, we have in the Old Testament, of course, you know, record of tablets being used, like stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. Also in Isaiah 30, verse 8, write it on a tablet, inscribe it on a scroll. See, tablets were used during the Old Testament time. But most of the manuscripts of the Old Testament were probably written on parchment scrolls in the early days of the Old Testament. Now, parchment, or vellum, you can also call this vellum, V-E-L-L-U-M. The Greek word for this type of writing material is membrana, spelled M-E-M-B-R-A-N-A. Membrana. What word do you see in that word, membrana?
Membrane.
Membrane, which means skin. See, skin. Parchment or vellum is animal skin. And usually it was the skin of an unborn calf or an unborn goat, an unborn sheep, and they would take that tender skin of an unborn animal and they would stretch it out and they would chalk it up and they would stretch it and make it into a fine writing. And then they would sew it together with other pieces of skin and make it into scrolls like this one. We'll look at scrolls again, but a lot of the early manuscripts were produced on scrolls. The book of Jeremiah was written on a scroll. Remember in Jeremiah 36? And as the scroll was unrolled, the king Jehoiakim would cut a piece of it off and throw it into the fire. So scrolls were a big part of the way ancient Old Testament people kept the Bible. Jeremiah in Daniel 9 verse 2, I understood from the scrolls, from the books, according to the word of Jeremiah the prophet. See, there was a box of scrolls like this, the scroll of Isaiah, the scroll of Jeremiah, the scroll of the Torah, the law. These were the scrolls. In the New Testament, the word biblion means a scroll. Biblion, scroll. So they handed Jesus the scroll of Isaiah, like this. The eunuch would have been reading the scroll of Isaiah, like this. So parchment scrolls is one of the main ways that these books were transmitted. Now the other major writing material that the books of the Bible were copied on is papyrus, P-A-P-Y-R-U-S. Papyrus.
Can you spell that again, please?
Yes?
Could you spell that again, please?
P-A-P-Y-R-U-S. Papyrus. The papyrus is a plant that grows in the marshes along rivers. And like in Egypt and other places in the Near East, there are these big plants in the reeds called papyrus. What you have to do is cut into the stalk of the plant, and inside the stalk of the plant there's this white strips of pith. You take this white stuff out, and it's in strips, and you lay it, as you see here, you lay a row of vertical strips and a row of horizontal strips, and then you put flat rock on top of it, real heavy weight, and you smash it down into itself, and you let it dry. And what you have when you get done letting it dry is a fine, smooth piece of writing material. And the people of Egypt used a lot of papyrus to write on. And many of the earliest New Testament manuscripts are written on papyrus. Papyrus is a plant, see? And it's different than parchment or vellum, which is the skin of animals. So the Old Testament manuscripts were primarily, first of all, written on animal skins, parchment, vellum, membrana. The New Testament manuscripts, a lot of our oldest New Testament manuscripts, were written on papyrus, and then later on, when Christianity was legalized and they could afford better writing material, a lot of our manuscripts are also written on parchment or vellum. All right, so the two major types of material on which manuscripts are written are parchment and papyrus. The oldest fragment of the New Testament that we still have is P52, papyrus number 52. It's called the John Rylands fragment, the John Rylands papyrus. It is a fragment of the 18th chapter of the Gospel of John, and it dates from around 100 A.D. Now let's think about that for a minute. This little piece of the Gospel of John dates around 100 A.D. The Apostle John was still alive in 100 A.D. The Apostle John didn't die until the reign of Trajan. So if this thing dates from 100 A.D., John was still alive when this thing was copied. That kind of blows your mind. But if some people say, well, the New Testament's really not a first century document, well, this kind of blows that theory. Because this piece of actual physical evidence actually dates from the end of the first century, the beginning of the second century. Right now, that is papyrus. You can see on you've got the recto and verso side, which is the front and back. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen there the horizontal lines of the papyrus going up and down there. You can see that it's a piece of papyrus. So this is our oldest fragment of the New Testament that we still possess. This is a piece of parchment. This is not papyrus. This is animal skin. And this is one of the oldest fragments we have of the Old Testament. This is the kind of thing we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this ancient Hebrew that is written on this is the type of thing that we see in the parchment scrolls of the Old Testament that we have.
Dan?
Yes, sir.
How do they date those? How do they date that is from around 100 AD?
Well, its dating of manuscripts is based on what's called paleography. Paleography. Paleography is the study of ancient writing. And scribal writing, the way the scribes made their letters, evolved. It changed over time. And we have so many manuscripts that are from so many different time periods that we can watch the evolution of the forms of the letters over time. And I'll give you a couple of examples here, just for grins. Give you a visual. This could be, expanded exponentially, but we'll just talk about an example here. Okay. Let's see. In Greek, you learn to make your upsilon like this. However, if you were a first century scribe writing an upsilon, you would make it like this. Yeah, it's not a gamma, that's an upsilon. Okay? But what happened is, as time went by, and the tail got shorter, sort of like, the monkey lost his tail and stuff like that and developed into a man, sort of. But this actually happened in the writing of the upsilon, until finally the upsilon was just written like this. What happened was, as the centuries went by, the tail got shorter until it was finally made like this. Now, that's just one letter. There are other letters. For example, you have this letter.
Delta.
We lost your sound, Dan.
Sound, have you got me now or not?
Yeah, we got you. Back.
Okay, this is a delta. And as you know, as time went by, you know, you've got the delta, and it had a little thing right there, and then you've got the delta, and it had a little thing like yay, and then you got the delta, and it had a little thing like that, and then, you know, as time went by, we could draw this in a whole bunch of different forms, but before long, it had changed into something like that, see, because this tail kept getting longer, and there was an evolution in the letter, see. Now, all of the letters, different letters of Greek evolved over the centuries, and we've got so many letters that we can compare in so many different manuscripts that we can take a whole spread of 5,000 manuscripts, and we can take a particular manuscript and we can flop it down with those others, and we can say, you know, that one fits about right here, doesn't it? So the paleography dates those manuscripts to a high degree of accuracy. Because you're not talking about just one or two letters, you're talking about the way they made all their letters. And at a particular time in history, Greek scribal letter making was at a particular spot, and you can identify which ones go with which ones. It's a very interesting science. But that's how we date the manuscripts, basically. That's an oversimplified explanation, but it's good enough for our purposes. So, does Dan believe in evolution? Yes. The
I was
evolution.
just going to say I got to write evolution and didn't have to worry about it.
Yeah, the evolution of the Greek language. In fact, any language that is still alive and being written will evolve and change. It will not only evolve and change in the way it's being written, but any language that is still being spoken will change in the way that it's spoken and in the meanings of the language. Okay? Every living language is in a state of constant evolution. Only dead languages that are no longer spoken, like Koine Greek and ancient Hebrew, those languages don't change anymore. See? Now, isn't that interesting? Because they'll always be the same and can always be translated into new and modern languages. God said, you know, all flesh is grass, and the glory of the flesh is the flower of the grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord remains forever. Okay, so this is Hebrew written on papyrus, not papyrus, but parchment, vellum, membrana. Now, when these ancient scrolls are written and found later, this scroll's been in the ground in some cave for many, many centuries. They're very fragile, they're very dry, they're very crumbly, and it's very difficult to get them open so that you don't destroy them while you're trying to open them. So they have to humidify them, and they have to do everything just exactly right, and have to very, very painstakingly open them and flatten them out, put them under glass, so that they're not damaged in the process of doing that. It's a very difficult thing to do. Guys like this guy right here copied Bible manuscripts and all kinds of other books in ancient times. This guy here is an Egyptian. He's not a Hebrew. He's an Egyptian. He has a leather apron on, and he has a roll of papyrus in his hand, and he's got a stylus in his hand, and he is taking dictation on a roll of papyrus. See? This is how lots of copies were made. For example, if you turn to Jeremiah 36, again, Jeremiah 36. Well, Let's see here. Jeremiah 36:4. Frankie, stays quiet. So Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and while Jeremiah dictated all the words the Lord had spoken to him, Baruch wrote them on the scroll. So now, see, Baruch wasn't an Egyptian like this guy. His hair would have been different, and he probably would have had his shirt on. But he had him a scroll like this, and he was listening to everything Jeremiah said, and he was writing down everything Jeremiah said on a scroll. Like this dude right here. And it was a manuscrito. It was a handwritten. Everything there. See, this is another picture of an Egyptian scribe, except this Egyptian scribe has his hat on. He's got his headdress on. This last dude back here did not have his hat on, but if he had had his hat on, he would have looked just like this dude over here. See, he's got his leather apron, he's got his papyrus roll, he's got his stylus in his hand, he's ready to take notes. He's a secretary. He's a scribe. Here's another shot of another guy. That's another stone relief of an Egyptian scribe. Now, Egyptians were basically Negroid. They were black people, basically. They were from Africa. They were of African lineage, and they were of a particular type. When you see old archaeological reliefs of Egyptians, they have this racial characteristic to them. There's another Egyptian scribe. Okay, we've got all kinds of them in stone reliefs and stone cuts and stuff back from the time of the ancient pharaohs, the times of Moses. These would have been the kinds of people that copied down stuff. Now, these scribes here are Syrian scribes, it looks to me, from the look of them. These do not look to me like Egyptian scribes. These look like Syrian scribes. Their hair, their facial features, and so forth are different. But in this particular stone cut, you can see the little ink palettes that the guy has up on near the top. There's a little ink palette that he has. You can see their styli, their stylus that they used to write. And they had little stands here that they were using to prop their papyrus on or whatever so they could write. They had those little leather cases that they kept their ink pads and their styli and stuff in up there. So this is a very interesting stone cut that is used to describe a group of scribes. Now, a group of scribes that are taking dictation is called a scriptorium. Scriptorium. See, that's how you made multiple copies. You didn't have a Xerox machine. You had to have more guys. And if you had 5 guys all taking dictation, then they could make 5 copies. See? It'd be slow going. Every word would have to be written down. See? So this is called a scriptorium. Now, if John was going to write a letter and send it to the 7 churches, that may mean that he needed to make 7 copies in order to send out to the 7 churches. But there's a lot in Scripture that implies copies. Even if it was sent just 1 copy, they would make a copy at each of those churches. All right, so these are scribes in a scriptorium. These are Syrian scribes. They look very different than Egyptian scribes. This is another archaeological relief that we have. Shows the stylus and shows the writing. It's a little bit crude in its depiction, but you still get the idea. These look more like God's people would have looked, those other guys. Now these are Egyptian scribes again. See their hair, and they've got the styli stuck in their hair. They've got extra pins stuck up in their hair. That's not their rat tail combs they got up in there. That's their extra reed pins. If you look at the ones, if you look at their palette, see they have a kind of a board, and then out to the side of their board they have that little fan-shaped ink palette where they can put their ink, and they can dip their pen in it, you know, as they're writing. This is very interesting because it really gets into some of the ways that it was actually done. But this is a picture of a scriptorium, various scribes in a scriptorium that are taking that dictation. In Ezekiel chapter 9, if you'll turn to Ezekiel chapter 9. Ezequiel capítulo 9. Versículo 2, verse 2. Ezekiel 9, verse 2. Brother Jess.
Behold, 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, with faces north, each with his shattering weapon in his hand. Among them was a certain man clothed in linen, with a writing case at his loins, and they went in and stood beside the bronze altar.
All right, a writing kit or a writing case involved these things right here. The thing in the middle is the stylus. A stylus was made out of a piece of reed, and if you look at the end of it, the pointy end, it was like a hypodermic needle. It was cut off at an angle. See how it's cut off at an angle, like the end of a hypodermic needle? And in the end of it, it was slit at the end, so it would suck up the ink. So it was shaved off to a point like a hypodermic needle, and sometimes a little split in the end so that it would suck up the ink. So when he dabbed his reed pen in there, he could write on the papyrus. The little jar up top is a water jar, and the little palette there with the 2 holes is for mixing ink. The ink was a combination of what they called nut gall that was made from grinding up the nuts, and then it was lamp black. A lot of times the soot off of lamps was used to mix in with it, and water, and there may have been another ingredient or 2, but basically nut gall and lamp black and water mixed in this little thing, and then he would just dip his pen in there and write on the papyrus or write on the parchment, depending on the professionalism of the scribes, either very carefully and very fine script, or just, you know, kind of random like some people write, but depending on who was doing the copy. So this is a picture of the scribal kits that were normally used. Now, let me think here. Who wants to ask a question right now? Or not? Or not? Okay, let's salir a la asamblea, and then let's volver otra vez after chapter.